Welcome back. To begin with today, we'll be looking at two C# selection statements. These will be the if statement and the switch statement. Selection statements allow us to alter or branch the code execution based on the evaluation of an expression. We'll also look at arrays. These let us collect and manage groups of data, and this will lead us to looking at iteration statements. Iteration statements let us loop through each item in a group of data, and we can do various things. Each item in the array can be changed or evaluated depending on what we want to do within our application. Today we'll discuss three iteration statements: the for each statement, the for statement, and the while statement. Then, to show you how it works in a real working situation and why it's so important, we'll put all the concepts together. So with selection statements, you make the decision whether or not to execute a block of code based on the evaluation of an expression. So we'll write a code to demonstrate. Create a new project and call it Lesson 5. I'll place a button and the combo box on our Forms Designer surface. Then I'll add some names and things to the combo box. Then double-click button 1 and write most of our code demonstrations against the click event. Now I'll just show you some examples which were made earlier. So we'll start with an if statement. So the first keyword is if. Then there is a set of parentheses. In between the parentheses, we are evaluating an expression. So we discussed this in the last lesson. Here we'll test to see what combo box selection was. Was it James, Jane, John, or Jennifer? And if it's James, then we can see under the if statement the next line's a code. It's a code block which would have curly braces around it. Say that combo box 1.text equals James. We use the equals evaluator there, which is two equal signs together. Then it'll execute these lines of code that are within the code block right underneath the if statement. So we'll run this application and let's see if it works. If I click on a different name, it doesn't work. However, if I select James and click the button, we get a message box saying you pick James. So it works. Now we'll look at a second example. We're still testing the condition combo box 1.text. Now we'll check to see if it's equal to Jane. In this example, I've taken out the curly braces. In C# there isn't a need for curly braces to define a code block if you're only going to execute one line of code after the if statement. So here I only have one line of code after the if statement. And this line of code will execute if the condition is true in the if statement, which is combo box 1.text equals Jane. So we'll run this and I'll click on something different again. So although messagebox1.show statement isn't in curly braces and we haven't selected the name Jane, it still doesn't execute. However, I do get the message box when I select Jane. Now for the third example. We'll make it slightly more complex and we'll add two new thoughts. So to start with, I'll put an if statement within another if statement. So in the first lines of code, I check if combo box 1.text is not equal, here I've put an exclamation mark equal sign, to John. If that's not true, then we'll do some other tests. If combo box 1.text equals Jennifer, then the message box picks Jennifer. However, if it's not Jennifer, it'll display a further message box saying, I'm not sure who you picked. So here I've added a new element called else. Now, if the first condition isn't true, then the second one will run. So for example, if the statement if combo box 1.text equal Jennifer isn't true, then the code block underneath the else statement will be executed. There's also an else statement which links with the original if statement, the one which encloses the second if statement. If combo box 1.text not equal to John, now if it is equal to John, that would be the opposite, then the second else statement will be executed. Messagebox.show you picked John. So before running this, we'll put in a breakpoint. This way we can watch the execution of the code and monitor how it works. So I'll select Jane and click the button. The yellow line of execution comes up. When I hover the cursor over the word text, combo box 1.text equals Jane. So into the next line of code, and once I click it a few times, I get to the next if statement. It isn't equal to John, it's equal to Jane. Then the second if statement, if combo box 1.text equals Jennifer, this won't be true either because it's Jane. So then we go into the else statement. We skipped over the if statement because it wasn't true. So the message box will show, I'm not sure who you picked. So then after this, we'll pick Jennifer, and back to our code view and our example. So if combo box 1.text equals Jennifer, it does. This will then display the message box, you picked Jennifer. We'll carry on executing this line of code until we get out of the handler. Then we'll pick John and go back to our code examples and begin to step through. If combo box 1.text is not equal to John, that would be a false statement because it is equal to John. So then we'd assume the else statement would be executed, so that would display you picked John. So now we'll look at a different selection statement called the switch statement. So here we'll add a list box to our Forms Designer surface, and select Edit Items under Tasks. Then we'll type in some words like bar, band, widgets and gadgets. Close that then back to the code view and scroll down to the bottom of our existing example. We'll paste some code here and save it. So the first line of code is switch. We'll then evaluate listbox1.selectedItem. So which item was selected by the end user? So on that we'll perform a toString, reason being that the selected item will not bring it back in the format that we require. So now we'll evaluate the selected item for listbox1. So under the switch statement within the block of code I have some case statements. If listbox1.selected evaluates to the word bar, then the message box will display you picked bar. If we select band, it will show another message box. Lastly, there's a statement called default. Now this is a default case. So if the user selected something other than bar or band, then we'd run the lines of code under the default case. There's also a break statement underneath each of the case statements. This would basically stop the execution of code so that no other cases are considered. If we hit the break statement after we run this line of code, it'll basically exit out of our code block, which is defined by our curly braces. This way, no additional cases are evaluated. So we'll run this application and we'll add a break statement. So let's select band, go to code view and start stepping through it. As you can see, the selected item equals band. And you'll also see it went straight to case band and execute this line of code, and we get a message box saying you picked band. When we hit our break statement, it'll go right over the default statement and it will go to the end of our method. So it basically ignores all the rest of code within our switch statement. So if you have a huge variety of options, then the switch statement is useful. The if statement is useful if you have 2 or 3 options. But if you have lots of cases, then you'd have to use some complex if statements. So it's much more neater to put it within a nice switch statement. So that was all about selection statements, and the difference between the if statement and the switch statement is that they each have their separate strengths. There are 2 different tools which do similar things but are used in different situations. In software development, you'll find there's different ways of doing something. There's not necessarily a right or a wrong way, but more so the fact which is more effective in that particular case. Sometimes the if statement is a better way of solving the problem, and sometimes it's a switch statement. Now let's discuss arrays. In order to understand iteration statements better, we need to look at this concept of array. So what is an array? An array is a type of collection that allows you to group together a bunch of values that are related in some way. So for example, there could be a group of values of a price list for a particular item, or a group of values to show the bus arrival time. An array could include a class of students' exam results, or you can have a collection of values that are stored in a list box. So basically, an array can be any group of values together. When it comes to arrays, what you need to remember is that everything in the array must be the same data type. If you define an array, then you're basically defining a single variable of a single type, but that variable can hold more than one value. So the way you put values in and out of variables is different than your standard variable. So how do we define arrays? Now I've created an example of a sized array. In the first line of code, I have stringed my array. So after the keyword string for our data type, I've included square brackets. This basically informs C# that I'd like to create an array of type string. And to create an array of strings, we need to use the keyword new. And this we'll discuss in the next lesson. Then I've defined how many elements will be in my array. So here, there will be two values in my array, which are both a type string that will be handled by my array. The following two lines of code show how to set those values. So my array with an index of 0 equals James, and my array with an index of 1 equals Jane. Those two items will fit inside the variable myArray. So you'll note that all indexes used to access elements of an array are 0-based, so you can't begin with number 1, then go to number 2. If you tried putting in any more than 2, you'd get a message saying the index was outside the bounds of the array. Bounds basically means boundary, and the boundary for this array is that it can only accept 2 items and no more than that. Now we'll comment this out and stop the application. Now we can run the application, and when I click the button we get the value. So this shows you how to define a sized array. Now we'll discuss a different way to define an array. So here I have an initialized array. The syntax between examples 5 and 6 are different. The first bit, which is on the left side of the equal sign, appears to be the same, and that is that I'm defining a string array called myArray. However, on the right hand side of the equal sign, I don't use newString and pass in the number of elements that I want to define the size of the array as. I'm initializing the values of the arrays by passing in the strings, so the size is set to 4 items by default. So we'll run this application and see what happens. The index of 1 is the second element in the array, which was displayed in the message box. So the difference between the sized arrays and initialized arrays is how we define the size and where we set the values that will be contained within the variable myArray. So this was just a simple explanation of arrays. We haven't looked at other types of arrays like multidimensional arrays, or finding the boundaries of an array, or jagged arrays and other types of arrays which can be created. But you've learnt the main part about arrays, and the rest you can pick up knowledge as you go on and do further research. Now we'll look at iteration statements. An iteration statement lets you leap through each item in an array one at a time. Other statements will allow you to loop through until a particular condition is met. So we'll just look at a couple of simple examples of iteration statements, even though there are plenty of variations of them. So anyway, you'll note in this first line of code I've created and initialized my array. There are 4 elements. I've used a for each statement here. In that line of code, within the parentheses, I've added a temporary variable called string person. In other words, for each person that you could find in my array, then executes the code block that's right underneath the for each statement. So basically, we'll show the name of that person in a message box. Now, if we executed this line of code, we'd start with the first string in my array, which is James, and we'd show that in a message box. After this, the for each statement would move on to the next value in my array, temporarily assign that to the person variable, and then display whatever's inside the person variable. On this occasion, it would be Jane. This process would then be repeated until there are 4 message boxes, and then when we run the application, we can see the for each statement is a simple way to iterate through all the items within an array by pulling out each element of the array and putting it into a temporary variable that we defined within the for each statement. There are loads of things you could do, but we just displayed this into a message box. Now, let's look at the for iteration statement. This looks very different from the for each statement. This time, we won't deal with arrays. You don't always have to use iteration statements with arrays. So here, we'll look at the for statements and what's between the parentheses on the first line. So there are 3 sections within this for statement. There's int I equals 0, then separated from the next piece using an end-of-line character is a semicolon. Then is I less than 5, and that's separated from the last part, which is I++ with a semicolon. So the first part defines a temporary variable, I, and we're initializing I to the value of 0. After this, the next section is a condition. So, while I is less than 5, it'll carry on iterating through the code block, which is right underneath the for statement, which basically means everything that's between the curly braces. In this case, it would be one line of code, messagebox.show. Now the last part is that every time after we execute our code block and return to the for statement, we want to increment the value of I by 1. So we'll set a breakpoint and run our application. We'll first define I is equal to 0. So when you hover the cursor over it, it shows the value of I is 0. And when we press the Step Into button, it'll think about whether 0 is less than 5, which is true. Then we move down to our code block, and in this line of code we'll show the value of I. As it's an integer, we can now convert 0 to a string and display it in a message box. So previously I was 0, now I equals 1, and once again it'll be evaluated. So I is 1, which means it is less than 5. So we'll keep running the code block. Whilst I is equal to 1 right now, as we run the code, it'll be equal to 2, which is less than 5. And we continue this way. Then we'll step through this and we get 4. So now when we execute that section of code, I will be equal to 5. So 5 isn't less than, but equal to 5. When this happens, we come out of our for statement, and if there's any code following this, we continue with it. In this case, there isn't, so we'll just come out of this method. Now let's look at another example of iteration statement, which is the while statement. Now the difference between the for statement and a while statement is that we've defined the value that will keep track of our iterations outside of the scope of a while statement. So if we want to work on our while statement and not lose the value, then we come out of it, then this becomes important. So here, when we've finished iterating through according to the commands given within the while statement, we can still access the value of I and show that to the end user. So we'll create a text box and call it textbox1. So now here's the difference between the previous examples. Before we've hard-coded all the values, but now we'll let the user type in the value in the text box and let them decide the amount of times they want to iterate through the iteration statement. So we'll type a number in the text box, and while our iterator value is less than the value which has been typed in the text box, we'll continue to test the value of I and then display the final value of a while statement. So now we'll set a breakpoint and watch this execute. We'll use the number 2. Click the button and you'll see that I is equal to 0 and textbox1.text equals 2. So while I is less than 2, we're going to execute the code block under the while statement. I was 0, but now we'll execute a new line of code and then I will equal 1. So unlike the for statement, the increment of a while statement is not handled within a while, but is handled by the user inside the body of the code block. We'll keep on executing this because 1 is less than the value 2. So we'll increment that once more, type equal to the value 2, we'll take this out of our while statement and then go on to the last statement. So the value of I is still accessible to us because it was defined outside the context of our while statement and can display the final value as 2. After the looping, we can determine what I was and keep using it throughout the context of our method. So basically, there you saw 3 different iteration statements that, although they are doing the same thing, which is iterating through executing a block of code, they're also different depending on what's going on within our code. So now let's put these together into a single example. We'll have arrays, iteration statements, and selection statements all together in one example. In the first line of code, string my array, we're defining an array and initializing its values, the 4 elements, James, Jane, John, and Jennifer. The next line of code is a for statement, and we're defining an iterator and initializing its value to 0. In the next line of code within the for statement, we'll evaluate the value of I, and we need to ensure it's less than my array dot length. So the dot length in my array is a property of an array which tells me how many elements are currently in the array. So the value of length will be 4 because of the number of elements in the array, James, Jane, John, and Jennifer. So as long as I is less than 4, then we're going to add 1 to the I value and iterate through the code block under the for statement another time. Now you'll note there's an if statement in the code block. If my array element of I equals John, then execute the block of code underneath your if statement. This is just a message box that shows we've found the element of the array that contains the value John. So here I've used a dynamic value, the value of I, our iterator, instead of hard-coding the index of my array. This way I can check the value that is stored within that particular value of I. So when my array with an index of 0 checks it, it will see that it's equal to John. And it will continue to do this until it finds John, and when it does, then we will execute the message box. So we'll add a line break here and run our application. So we'll click a button and start to step through. So I is equal to 0, and is I less than my array? Remember, the length is equal to 4 and my cursor is hovering over that property. So then we'll start to execute my array sub-0. Is that equal to John? No, it isn't. So then increase the value to 1. Is 1 less than 4? Yes. So repeat, and is my array with an index of 1 equal to John? No, it isn't. So we'll increment, evaluate it, and check it again. Is my array with an index of 2 equal to John? Yes, so we found John and we can show the message box. Found John. So we'll execute the next line of code and we'll see that we didn't break out of the loop. We're going to evaluate the next value. But if we wanted to stop and not execute any more lines of code, we would need to add a break statement in the next line after our message box.show. So the break statement applies to switches, if statements, and for statements. And now we reach the point where is I equal to 4, so we can come out of this and end the execution of our method. This next example features the list box, and here I'd like to change one of its properties. I'd like to allow a multi-selection. So the selection mode is set to 1, but I shall select multi-simple. This should let us select multiple items in the list box by holding down either the Shift or Control button on the keyboard. Now we'll return to the code example. We'll begin with a for statement and we'll create an iterator which we'll call I, but you can call it anything you like. So int I equals 0. Then evaluate I against the amount of items selected. So use listbox1.selected.count. So I want to find out how many items were selected by the end user. And that's the amount of times we want to loop through our code block under the for statement. After this, increase the iterator by 1. In the next line of code, switch statement, we want to find current value starting with 0 for the first selected item. Then on to the second selected item, etc. The selected items will return one item and let us evaluate within the context of a switch statement. So we'll see what the first selected item was and show the value in the message box. So this method will be used constantly in Windows or web forms in order to determine what was selected by the end user and act upon that. So we'll set a breakpoint here and run our application. I'll select Band and press Control down on the keyboard and select Gadgets, then click button 1. Then we'll start stepping through. 2 items were selected. Then with the first item that was selected, you'll see it goes straight to the case of Band. It'll then display a message box. So that's the first iteration finished, and we'll then increment I from 0 to 1 and make sure that 0 is less than 2, which were the number of items selected. The second item is a 1, so we can evaluate that, and it was Gadgets, so we can display that in a message box. So we found both items that were selected. We'll keep on evaluating, but this time 2 is equal to the count 2, so this will just finish. Basically, that's a very important and useful bit of code that you'll constantly be writing again and again to evaluate what values are selected, etc. So in this lesson we've touched on selection statements, which allows you to branch depending on the condition, and iteration statements, which allow you to loop through and execute the code based on what the criteria is. And we've also looked at arrays, which are groups of values that are linked together into a single variable that we can process. So these three programming features enable us to create intelligent applications that can respond more effectively to the user and make decisions based on what the user inputs. In the next lesson, we'll look at some more advanced programming. But then, until then, do take care, and thank you very much. Bye-bye.